Bismarck, who was dismissed as prime minister in around 1890, recognized the dangers of this region moving forward. And he said, even at that point, that it would be some damn thing in the Balkans that leads to a major conflict. And he was absolutely right. So the last video I did about this, I don't think I did a very good job. So let's just talk about where it was at and really look at what happened even in my lifetime. So here's what the Balkans look like prior to the First Balkan War. You can see that Bosnia had been annexed by Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary, very much a multi-ethnic state. That's as nationalism rose. It became clear it would be very difficult, even more difficult for Austria-Hungary to maintain control. And their expansion into the Balkans would make that even more complicated. But as that was happening, the Ottomans were clearly weakening. And we see the First Balkan War was an assault on the Ottoman Empire. So it's after the First Balkan War that we see the Ottomans basically reduced from having any influence in Europe. We see the expansion of Bulgaria, we see the expansion of Serbia and of Greece. The Second Balkan War, the Bulgarians were not satisfied with the border they had with Greece. So the other Balkan countries, namely Romania, Serbia, and Greece, basically turn on Bulgaria and limit Bulgaria's expansion. So really almost most things that Bulgaria gained in the First Balkan War, they lost in the Second. So this is what the Balkans look like after the Second Balkan War. Again, a reduced influence of the Ottoman Empire. To this day, they really only control Istanbul, what was known as Constantinople at that time. But as nationalism rose amongst these groups, it would lead to significant issues in the future. As you may or may not know, following World War I, the nation of Yugoslavia is created. Yugoslavia roughly translates as Union of Southern Slavs. So at this point in history, the people living in the Balkans, even though they had their differences, saw a unified state together as better than being dominated by Austria or by Russia or by any other power. So they do establish independence, but that's unsettled as well. And you can see why. Serbia would dominate it. They would dominate Yugoslavian politics. And as we've talked about, it's in this part of the world that we see three major religions and cultures collide. Serbians or Eastern Orthodox, much like a significant percentage of the Russian population. The Croatians, we see the influence of Rome. Croatians are predominantly Roman Catholic, as are Slovenians. Bosnians, we see the influence of the Ottomans. Bosnians and Albanians and Kosovars are predominantly Muslim. And as nationalism rose, these differences would prove difficult. Let's fast forward to the post-Yugoslav period. So following the death of Marshal Tito, and in one of the classes I talked about him, Joseph Tito was the dictator of Yugoslavia. One could make an argument that he was a benevolent dictator, was popular amongst his people, and was able to stifle those views of nationalism. And when Tito died, those extreme nationalists rose again to express their desire to create a complete and unified Serbia, a complete and unified Croatia, particularly, and all the other ethnic groups. But Serbia was the dominant group. And if you look at this map, this is what happened in my lifetime. So Serbia, you can see over here, and what's highlighted is Bosnia. In Bosnia, as you wrote, and here's the capital, Sarajevo. In Bosnia, as you've read, Bosnia was multi-ethnic. Um, but there were a large number of Serbians living in Bosnia. Around the time of the First World War, there were like 4 million Serbians living in Bosnia. When Tito died and those expressions of nationalism were allowed, what the Serbian government wanted to do was expand the borders of Serbia into Bosnia to incorporate that large percentage of of Serbians living in Bosnia. The problem was, obviously, as you saw in that previous map, is there were Bosnians and Croatians and other ethnic groups that had been living and mixed together. So what under Tito and really throughout most of history had been peaceful neighbors, with the rise of nationalism, it shows us the dangers of it, because what took place was a terrible civil war and some of the worst genocides of the latter part of the 20th century. And I'll just draw your attention to one. What you see in this color, whatever you call that, pink, I don't know, was controlled by Bosnian Serb forces, meaning they were Serbian, but they lived in Bosnia. The yellow here were territories controlled by Croatia, and this is Croatia down the coast as a country and up and around. What you see in gray was controlled by the Bosnian army. The Bosnian army, again, this is Bosnia. They were protecting their home country, and they were predominantly Muslim. What the United Nations did is they established a few places where refugees could go as a result of the war. One was Gorazde. There's a great book written by Joe Sacco about Gorazde. It was an incredible story. Another was Zipa. Maybe the most infamous was Srebrenica. What these places were supposed to be places where mostly Bosnians could escape the war and be protected by the United Nations. As the regular Serbian army tried to join forces with the Bosnian Serb army, and also included in that would be a number of paramilitary forces, basically Serbian militias that operated independently. They would try to dominate this region. And in an attempt to expand this border to include all of the Serbian people living in Bosnia, what they attempted to do essentially was commit genocide. And one example, or one event, is known as the Srebrenican massacre, when Bosnian Serb forces surrounded the city and they arrested every man. There was about 11,000 men, and they put them inside of a abandoned warehouse and lit it on fire. All of those men obviously perished in that fire, and it's one of the terrible war crimes, and there were many war crimes committed during this conflict. That is what this conflict that I'm describing here is mostly what the video you're going to watch first in this unit is about. So as nationalism rose, just to bring it back to the part of history we're talking about, as nationalism rose 100 plus years ago, it would have a lasting effect. And when it rears its ugly head into the future, awful, awful things happen. And we heard the French President Macron denounce nationalism, and this is at a time when and maybe hopefully it's just because he doesn't understand what it means, but we've heard our own president call himself a nationalist, which to historians is frightening.